In 1962, the movie begins at Paris airport. We see a man named Lucio getting out of a car and entering the airport with a bag while his wife waits outside. Shortly after, his wife notices strange activity and a significant police presence around the airport. She rushes inside to warn him, telling him that the police have been alerted and they need to act quickly. Lucio looks behind him and sees Inspector Costello, realizing he's cornered. However, he stays sharp and notices a scout group at the airport. In that moment, he opens the bag, takes out the dollars, and calls out to the scout group, throwing the money into the air, causing chaos as people scramble to grab the cash. The story then flashes back 20 years, to a village called Cascati in Spain. We see Lucio running from a farm after stealing some food to bring home, where he lives with his sick father. His father suffers daily from pain and needs strong medications, but due to lack of money, Lucio decides to take a knife and attempt to rob the local bank. There, he meets a bank employee who knows him and asks about his family. When Lucio pulls out the knife, he becomes afraid and loses his nerve, leaving the knife and walking away. Later, we learn that his father has died from the illness, and his sister Satur is preparing to travel to France to work in homes there. Lucio wants to travel with her to stay by her side, but she reassures him that she will be fine and will find a place to eat and sleep, while he would have to sleep on the streets if he followed her. She also reminds him that he still has military service to complete. 10 years later, Lucio visits Paris, where he meets his sister Satur, who is now married and living a comfortable life. There, he meets her husband Patrick, who works at a currency mint. Lucio tells his brother-in-law that he deserted the army after growing tired of it and asks for his help in finding a job. Patrick tells him he knows a friend in construction who can help him find work. Lucio starts working in construction, showing energy by carrying bricks. There, a man named Asturiano asks him to slow down a bit so that he doesn't make the others look bad in comparison. Lucio meets other workers like Herman and Asturiano, who talk about their political inclinations and parties. They ask him about his views, and he responds that he doesn't like taking orders from anyone. Herman tells him that his thinking resembles that of anarchists. Later, Lucio joins a group distributing leaflets for the anarchist party. They clash with the French police, and Lucio manages to strike an officer before fleeing with the group. Lucio begins learning French and meets Herman again, who asks him for a favor, to host a man named Kiko Sabate, one of the party's wanted leaders. Kiko comes to France to carry out some operations and plans to leave afterward. Lucio meets Kiko, who invites him to join a bank robbery. During the heist, the two manage to take control of the bank with their weapons, but Lucio experiences the same fear he felt when he was younger. However, this time, Kiko helps him regain his focus and complete the robbery. They return home, and Kiko tells Lucio that the first experience is always hard, but he will improve over time. He assures him that their goal isn't to steal for money, but to weaken the capitalists and fight them with their own money. Kiko explains how the stolen money will be divided. One part goes to the associations they support, another part to their friends in prison and their families, and the remainder for their personal expenses, such as buying a car for transportation. They successfully rob another bank, but this time, the news reaches Inspector Costello, who personally takes on the investigation. Through the bank employees, the inspector discovers that the robbers spoke with a Spanish accent, leading him to suspect that they are members of the Spanish Anarchist Party, prompting him to plan a raid on their headquarters. During this period, we see the party members gathered at their headquarters, discussing how to change the world into a better place where the poor can live side by side with the rich. Suddenly, they hear the sounds of police cars everywhere, and the headquarters turns into chaos. Some try to escape, while others, including Lucio, are arrested. Everyone is taken to a police lineup where they are made to speak in front of the bank employees to identify their voices. Inspector Costello forces them to talk so that one of the bank employees can recognize Lucio's voice, confirming that he is the person who attacked the bank. The inspector asks Lucio about his other partner and the location of the money, then leads the police forces to search his house. Lucio is terrified because the money and weapons are hidden in the house, but luckily, the police find nothing. Lucio realizes that Kiko, when he fled, had gone to the house and hidden the money and weapons. As a result, Inspector Costello is forced to release him but places him under surveillance. Lucio returns to work again, and Herman tells him that they should stop escalating their actions and focus on their work so that their fate doesn't end in prison or death. But Lucio replies that the banks are robbing them and they need to reclaim their dignity from the system. Lucio leaves work, but notices a car following him. At first, he thinks it's a police car, but he discovers it's Kiko, and they go to talk. Lucio begins to be influenced by Herman's words and tells Kiko that their revolution should continue through printing leaflets and distributing them to everyone. However, Kiko doesn't like this idea and wants to continue robbing banks and selling weapons. They find out that the revolution in Cuba, led by Che Guevara, has begun, and Kiko sees this as a good opportunity for them to continue their struggle. When they can't agree on a common course of action, Kiko decides to travel to Spain. Lucio warns him of the possibility of dying there, but Kiko responds that he would rather die fighting than live as a coward, and he leaves. Later, Lucio and Asturiano go to a bank to request a loan of 10,000 francs to buy a printing press for producing their leaflets, but the bank refuses due to a lack of collateral. They become furious with the arrogant way the employee treats them, and when Lucio leaves the bank, he finds Inspector Costello waiting for him. Costello informs him that Kiko died that day in Spain and reminds him that he is still under surveillance until he is captured. Lucio returns home to confirm the news of Kiko's death, and then he and Asturiano decide to rob the bank that refused them the loan. After securing the money they need, they finally buy the printing press. There, Lucio meets an elderly woman named Janet, known as Jeanne, who tells him she has worked in printing since she was 14 years old. Lucio offers her to join their team due to her extensive experience, offering her a generous salary, and she agrees. At that moment, Herman arrives, angry about the decision to rob the bank, telling them that what they did was a mistake. A fight ensues between him, Lucio, and Asturiano, and Herman leaves. The two start to suspect that Herman might report them to the police. After that, a girl named Anne and her friend arrive to pick up their leaflets for organizing a protest at the university. Anne gives Lucio a flyer and tells him that he can attend if he wishes. The next day, Lucio goes and watches as Anne speaks about the role of youth in changing and building a better society. During her speech, the police arrive, and a large confrontation breaks out. Lucio intervenes to help her, but gets injured while struggling with one of the security officers. Anne thanks Lucio for his help, and they get to know each other better. Lucio shares the ideas of his party and the movement he belongs to, and Anne decides to join them because she shares the same beliefs and wants to change the world. Over time, a romantic relationship develops between them, and they grow closer. Meanwhile, Inspector Costello continues to surveil them excessively. It gets to the point where the chief commissioner meets with Costello and asks why he's abandoning all his duties to monitor two people in love on the street, instructing him to focus on his primary work. Later, news spreads about the Cuban Revolution and the tensions between Cuba and the United States. Lucio decides they should print leaflets condemning the situation, and Asturiano agrees with him. But Jean suggests using the printing press not only for political papers, but also for printing counterfeit money and fake passports. This gives Lucio an idea, and he takes Anne to meet Patrick, his brother-in-law, who had quit his job a while ago. Lucio proposes that Patrick join them, as he is the most experienced with currencies due to his previous work at the currency mint. With no other option, Patrick agrees, and they start manufacturing counterfeit dollars. They experiment several times until they finally succeed in producing almost perfect replicas. To ensure their quality, Lucio goes to a bank and exchanges them for French francs. When they succeed, they feel immense joy after their accomplishment. We then see Herman sitting with Inspector Costello, revealing that Lucio and Asturiano's suspicions were correct. Later, Lucio appears in a meeting with the Cuban ambassador, explaining his plan. He intends to supply Cuba with counterfeit dollars to buy weapons and spread the fake money worldwide to destabilize the U.S. economy. The ambassador replies that this matter is beyond her authority, but she informs him that Che Guevara will soon visit the Soviet Union and will be in Paris briefly, giving him the chance to present his idea to him. Time passes, and the film returns to the first scene, where we see Lucio at the airport on his way to meet Che Guevara. When he meets him, Lucio presents his idea, and while Che Guevara thanks him for his enthusiasm, he tells him that counterfeit dollars won't be the tool that destroys America. He adds, "A flea will never defeat an elephant." Che Guevara departs, leaving Lucio to reconsider his plan. As Lucio leaves the airport, we see the police, led by Inspector Costello, searching for him. Lucio cleverly pretends to make a phone call in a public booth, giving him the opportunity to escape. However, Herman, who is sitting in a car outside, sends a message as soon as he sees Lucio, leading to his arrest. We see Lucio in prison, where he spends some time. During this period, someone tries to kill a man named Charlie, but Lucio intervenes and saves him. Grateful, Charlie tells Lucio that he owes him his life and will be ready to help him with anything. A few days later, Anne arrives with a lawyer named Terry, telling Lucio that he will be granted parole. Anne also informs him that she is pregnant with a girl, and they share their happiness over the news. Lucio spends a long time in prison, but eventually, he is released. He rushes out to embrace his wife and daughter, feeling overwhelming joy. 8 years pass, and Lucio returns to working in construction. When he goes to collect his pay from the contractor, he is surprised when the contractor gives him a traveler's check. Lucio is confused, thinking the contractor is trying to cheat him, but he reluctantly accepts the check. Later, Lucio goes shopping at a supermarket with his wife and daughter, but the cash he has isn't enough. When he tells the cashier he will pay the remaining amount later, she refuses, but notices the traveler's check and tells him he can use it to pay the difference. She accepts the check and gives him change in cash, making Lucio realize that traveler's checks could be a powerful tool. Lucio meets again with John, Asturiano, and Patrick, telling them about a new invention called the traveler's check, which can be exchanged for money anywhere. Although his friends are skeptical about the idea's effectiveness, Lucio plans to print counterfeit checks this time, targeting a large American bank called Citibank with the goal of destroying it. They all begin working on printing the counterfeit checks, and after several attempts, they manage to produce perfect replicas. Lucio himself goes to the bank to cash the check and discovers that the staff only verify the serial numbers. At that moment, Lucio decides to produce a large number of counterfeit checks and distribute them to a wide network of people. He devises a detailed plan, assigning each person to a different Citibank branch and instructing them to cash the checks simultaneously at noon to avoid raising suspicion or getting caught. The plan works, and they withdraw vast sums of money, dividing it into 3 parts as Lucio had learned from Kiko. The scene shifts to New York City, where the headquarters of Citibank is located. We see the head of security, Mr. Barrow, explaining the technique the scammers are using to rob the bank. He explains that the fraudsters purchase legitimate checks from checkbook holders with low serial numbers, then alter the serial numbers on the checks and print hundreds of counterfeit copies. Each branch verifies the serial numbers and finds them valid, allowing the checks to be cashed. However, when the counterfeit checks reach the main branch days later, the disaster is discovered. One of the board members expresses grave concern about the serious threat to the bank and assigns Mr. Barrow to travel to France to investigate the matter personally. Barrow arrives in France and meets with Inspector Costello, and together they plan to catch the person behind the check counterfeiting. At this time, Lucio is sitting with Anne, and she tells him that she has received an excellent job opportunity in Bolivia. She informs him that she wants to take their daughter Juliet with her, as she wishes to leave behind the life of theft and forgery, fearing that Lucio will either be killed or imprisoned again. However, Lucio refuses the idea and insists on continuing his revolution and never leaving France. A conflict arises between them, and it becomes clear that his team shares the same concerns. They feel that things have gotten too big, especially after targeting the largest bank in America, leaving them with no safety. Lucio ultimately decides to stop these operations, but tells them he has checks worth $3 million and wants to sell them at any cost to raise money and travel to Bolivia. Lucio goes to Charlie and asks for his help, reminding him that he owes Lucio his life. Charlie arranges a meeting with a man named Tony Greco, who is impressed when he sees the checks and agrees to buy the entire batch for 1/3 of the value. Tony needs a few days to gather the $1 million in cash. Later, Lucio returns home to find his sister and her husband Patrick there. They inform him that the police have been watching their house for some time and they feel unsafe. His sister asks him to stay away from them with his troubles. Jean also tells him she doesn't want to go to prison at her age, so she decides to step away and leave him. Lucio reassures Anne, telling her this will be the last time and he will take the money and stop for good. The next morning, Lucio heads off to meet Tony for the exchange, but he notices cars following him and manages to escape. He reaches the cafe and meets with Asturiano, waiting for Tony. When Tony arrives, Lucio is shocked to discover that the operation has been compromised and he is arrested. In prison, lawyer Terry visits him and tells him that all his colleagues have been arrested, though some may get parole, while Lucio's situation is more difficult. Terry also informs him that Patrick wasn't the traitor. It was Tony who was an undercover officer, and Charlie betrayed him after being threatened in prison. After Terry leaves, Lucio receives letters from Anne, informing him that she has left for Bolivia with Juliet and that they have settled there. Lucio begins reading their letters with joy, feeling relieved to know they are safe. When his trial date arrives, Terry manages to postpone the verdict due to errors in names and evidence. The lawyer submits the necessary papers for the case, and the court agrees to delay the sentencing. Lucio is granted parole until the next hearing. Meanwhile, we see Mr. Barrow arguing with Inspector Costello, expressing his frustration over how Lucio managed to secure parole. Costello explains that the police did their job, but the judiciary made its own decisions. After his release, Lucio meets with lawyer Terry, who tells him that Patrick didn't betray him and that Tony was the undercover officer. Charlie had betrayed him after being threatened in prison. Lucio then receives a threatening phone call, realizing that the situation is becoming more dangerous. He decides to execute his final plan, gathering a group of people from several countries and distributing the forged checks among them. The checks spread across Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, escalating the crisis. The situation reaches Mr. Barrow in New York, where he faces severe criticism from his superiors for failing to solve the problem. Barrow is sent to France, where he meets with Inspector Costello. Lucio meets with Barrow in the interrogation room and offers him a deal. If Citibank drops the case, he will hand over all the forged plates and remaining checks. He also requests a sum of money to start a new life, pointing out that the bank's losses will be catastrophic if the checks continue to circulate. Barrow starts to consider the offer, realizing that if the crisis persists, the bank will be forced to stop issuing checks, which would harm its global reputation. In the end, we see Lucio carrying a bag and heading to a hotel, indicating that Barrow has agreed to the deal. Lucio hands over the counterfeit plates and receives the money he requested. He then meets with Asturiano and Jen, telling them the flea has defeated the elephant, a reference to their success against the large bank. In the final scene, we see Lucio in Bolivia with his wife Anne and daughter Juliet. They sit together, planning their new life, and Lucio decides to stay with them forever, continuing his path of reform from there.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.